Among his many other entertaining quirks, the mad Emperor Caligula was inordinately proud of his oratorical skills. Suetonius reports, quote, Caligula used to say that Seneca, who was very popular just then, composed mere school exercises, and that he was sand without lime. The phrase used was Harena, sine calce. Coming from a completely unhinged emperor, the architectural metaphor is very ironic, but it probably echoes a popular aphorism based on practical experience. Sand, even the most reactive volcanic sand used by the Romans, produces a very poor mortar if insufficient lime is added. Pliny the Elder, slightly later in the 1st century AD, carries the topic of unstable concrete a little bit further. I quote, the principal reason for the collapse of buildings in Rome is cheating on the lime, as a result of which the aggregate is laid without a proper mortar, unquote. Today, as in Roman times, lime remains the most expensive component of standard mortars, and this type of fraud continues to cause extensive construction disasters where regulations are lax. Roman architects and builders who did use sufficient lime employed concrete construction called opus caementicium to great effect. They deployed remarkably creative designs and produced structures that in some cases have lasted 2,000 years without significant decay. Nevertheless, it's important to remember that the structures we see and study today are simply a very small sample of those that were constructed, even of those constructed with concrete, and that their survival is the result of a long process of natural and unnatural selection. The ancient Roman structures visible above ground level in Rome of the 21st century constitute a very small portion of the structures built during the late Republic and Empire. How did the others disappear? Obviously, the materials used will affect survival rates. The innumerable mud brick, timber, and wattle and daub structures of old Rome described by various Roman authors are long gone, as we might expect. But what was it that determined the survival of only some of the structures built of stone and concrete? Does the chronology of a building or its function determine the chances of survival in a living urban center over many centuries? The unspoken question is, were the Romans in fact such good construction engineers after all? Roman engineers constructed thousands of buildings with opus caementicium over a period of 500 years. Surely, a significant sample of these buildings would turn out to be remarkably durable, even by sheer accident, explaining the sample we see today. From this perspective, it's striking that a large and largely unexamined corpus of Roman literary and epigraphical sources and legal texts survives that documents construction disasters, incompetent architects, corrupt officials, fraudulent contractors, and cost overruns. There's also ample testimony to misjudged urban planning and flawed codes or regulations or inadequate enforcement of regulations, with resulting losses of life and property from fire and other disasters. What types of mistakes were made? What types of fraud committed? And what can we learn from them about the structures that survive? It's only possible to dip into the enormous pool of evidence this afternoon, and I've tried to present it in a light-hearted manner. For the most part, I will allow the Romans to speak for themselves through literary and inscriptional sources. I know of no ancient illustrations of Roman construction disasters to illustrate this discussion, which is understandable enough. Why would they illustrate a construction disaster? So I've manufactured a few of my own. For reasons that will soon become apparent, I apologize ahead of time to any architects, building contractors, and lawyers in the audience. First, let's examine a sample of these construction disasters, which seem to have been alarmingly characteristic of ancient Rome. In his encomium to the excellent location and magnificent development of the city, Strabo includes a somewhat backhanded compliment. It is because of this concourse of blessings that the city of Rome, although it has grown to such a size, holds out in the way it does, not only in respect to food, but also in respect to timber and stones for construction. Construction which goes on unceasingly in consequence of the collapses and fires and repeated sales. Indeed, the real estate sales are intentional collapses, as it were, since the purchasers keep tearing down the houses and building new ones, one after another, to suit their wishes. To provide against collapses, Augustus reduced the maximum heights of the new buildings on the public streets to 70 feet. Well, in Strabo's landscape of Rome, building collapses, destructive fires, and uncontrolled redevelopment are a major motif. The most famous account of the engineering perils of Rome, of course, is the lament of Umbricius in Juvenal's third satire, dating to the 2nd century. Umbricius has packed his belongings, and he leaves the city for a safer and more pleasant architectural environment. Who at cool Praeneste or at Volsinii, located among the wooded hills, or in simple Gabii? Who of these people fear the collapse of their house? We, however, live in a city that for the most part is balanced on slender props. For thus does the landlord support the tottering structures, and once he covers over the gaps of old cracks, he bids his tenants to sleep securely in a ruin ready to fall. Our friend Seneca protests in one of his letters, "Was it philosophy that erected all these towering tenements, so dangerous to the persons who dwell in them? Oh, believe me, it was a happy day before the days of architects, before the days of builders." However unpleasant for the tenants, the collapse of a rickety building could be a source of considerable profit for the owner by opening the site for lucrative redevelopment, without the expense of employing members of the Guild of Building Demolishers, the Collegium Subrutorum. In a letter to Atticus, the prominent statesman Cicero gloats over the imminent collapse of several of his income properties. "I summoned Chrysippus because 2 of my shops have fallen down and the rest are cracking," with the result that not only the tenants but even the mice have run away. Others say this is a disaster, but I think it's not even an inconvenience. Ah, Socrates, Socrates, I can never repay you for your philosophical insight. Heavens above, how trivial such things appear to me now. But nevertheless, on the advice and suggestion of Vestorius, a plan for rebuilding has been started that will make this loss profitable. Cicero may claim philosophical detachment, but he is more likely to have taken a cue from his despised contemporary, the rich skinflint Crassus, whose colossal fortune was based on profiting from collapse and conflagration. Plutarch reports that Crassus, quote, "observing how natural and familiar at Rome were such disasters as the conflagration and collapse of buildings, owing to their being too massive and close together, he proceeded to buy slaves who were architects and builders. Then, when he had over 500 of these, he would buy houses that were on fire, and the adjoining houses, and the owners would let these go at a trifling price, owing to their fear and the uncertainty of the outcome." Well, structural collapses were common enough in ancient Rome that the jurists comment on the liability of contractors hired to prop up a collapsing building, presumably hired by a landlord more altruistic than Cicero. Marcellus comments on this issue in the Digest. Regarding this stipulation, do you promise to shore up a block of apartments? There is a question when the legal action arises. One certainly does not have to wait until the building falls down, for the stipulator's interest lies in it being propped up rather than not. However, the legal action is ineffective if insufficient time has elapsed in which the contractor could have shored it up. Ironically, the urbane Seneca, the butt of Caligula's jokes we started with, comments enthusiastically on the importance of these rescuers of buildings, suggesting that their worth was greatly undervalued. How great a service he does to us who props up our tottering house and with incredible skill keeps erect a building block cracking from the foundation up. Despite all this, a contract for underpinning is made at a fixed and cheap rate. Seneca apparently had good reason to praise these craftsmen. In his work on tranquility of the mind, he mentions that the collapse of buildings was common in his neighborhood, disturbing his own mental tranquility. Often, he says, the roar of a collapsing building has resounded right next door. Understandably, the motif of building disasters appears frequently in Seneca's works. The very act of building could cause significant damage to streets and sewers, as wagons overloaded with enormous columns swayed through the streets of Rome. During his aedileship in 58 BC, Marcus Scaurus caused an enduring scandal by importing 360 marble columns into the city from Greece to decorate a temporary theater. He then boldly commandeered 4 of the largest for his atrium after the festival was finished. Pliny the Elder was still fussing about the incident a century later. Were not the laws silent also when the largest of these columns, each fully 38 feet long and of Lucullian marble, were placed in the atrium of Scaurus's house? And there was no secrecy or concealment. A sewer contractor forced Scaurus to give him security against possible damage to the drains when the columns were being hauled to the Palatine. Emperors could err in this regard as well, and Domitian was felt to have put the city at risk with his overly ambitious construction programs. Pliny the Younger praised his successor, the Emperor Trajan, for toning down the pace of construction. Your interest in Trajan in preserving what exists is matched by your restraint over further building. The walls and roofs of the city have stopped shuddering at the passage of huge blocks of stone, as they did during the reign of Domitian. Our houses stand safe and secure, and temples are no longer threatened with collapse. In another passage, Pliny's uncle provides ambiguous praise of Roman engineering in his description of the sewers beneath Rome's streets. In the streets above the sewers, massive blocks of stone are dragged along, and yet the tunnels do not cave in. They are pounded by falling buildings, which collapse of their own accord, or are brought crashing to the ground by fire. The ground is shaken by earth tremors. But in spite of all this, for 700 years the channels have remained essentially impregnable. Great sewers for sure, but the city above is collapsing. Fire, of course, was a constant danger in crowded Roman urban centers. This scourge was not necessarily the result of engineering mistakes, but it does reflect the absence of sufficient enforcement of building regulations regarding firewalls, spacing of structures, open fires, fireproof designs and building materials, and fire extinguishing equipment. Surprisingly, even stone and concrete structures could burn if they contained sufficient wooden structural material or flammable furnishings or goods. The Flavian amphitheater was closed for many years after a fire caused by a lightning strike in 217. Cassius Dio reports, its entire upper circuit and everything in the arena was consumed, and thereupon the rest of the structure was ravaged by the flames and reduced to ruins. Juvenal's wretched Umbricius, introduced to you above, provides dismal personal testimony to this danger, in addition to his account of collapsing buildings. One ought to live in a place where there are no fires, no nightly terrors. Ucaligon is calling for water. Already he is shifting around his pitiful belongings, and although the third story of your building is now full of smoke, you don't know it, for the alarm is given from the bottom floors. The last to burn will be the person who is sheltered from the rain by the roof tiles above. In this perilous city, buildings could burn even before completion, perhaps because of the vulnerability of wooden scaffolding and formwork. Roman lawyers naturally had fixed their beady eyes on this eventuality too. Pomponius provides the following opinion in the Digest. And therefore, there is some doubt if one part of the building block was built and then destroyed by fire, whether the entire contracted span of time for building the block should be started again, or whether one should in fact only allow the remaining period that was outstanding. The better legal view is that the contractor should be granted the original contracted period. The Great Fire of AD 64 in Rome, apparently watched with ill-concealed glee by the Emperor Nero as he sang an opera about the fall of Troy, spawned a major urban redevelopment. This reportedly involved wide, regular streets, open spaces, fireproof porticos fronting the building blocks, and new regulations concerning building. Tacitus reports that the height restrictions were imposed, or rather reimposed, along with the use of fireproof stone walls, and party walls were forbidden. If the contemporary redevelopment of Ostia is any reflection of what was going on in Rome, it seems likely that much of this rebuilding was carried out with brick-faced concrete. Nevertheless, there was another major fire in 80 that destroyed not only private buildings, but many temples and public buildings as well. These, presumably, constructed for the most part of stone. Despite efforts at rebuilding, again with brick-faced concrete, fire ravaged large parts of the city, again in 192 AD and 238. Roman concrete structures seem to have been more apt to explode in flames than the modern observer might expect. Perhaps one key to making such structures truly fireproof was the use of concrete vaulting and domes rather than wooden roofing, explaining the survival, for example, of the Pantheon, the Baths of Caracalla, and the Basilica of Maxentius. Why were such disasters during and after construction so characteristic of ancient Rome? Aside from fire, one can cite three major factors: incompetent architects, or an absence of architects altogether, incompetent contractors, or contractors who fraudulently employ defective materials, and poor maintenance. We'll deal with architects first. The best surviving presentation of the expectations facing a Roman architect appears in the preface to Vitruvius's De Architectura. Most likely gazing narcissistically in a mirror, Vitruvius describes a professional with the qualifications of Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo altogether. He says the architect should be, quote, a man of letters, a skillful draftsman, a mathematician, familiar with historical studies, a diligent student of philosophy, acquainted with music, not ignorant of medicine, learned in the responses of jurists, familiar with astronomy and astronomical calculations. This quotation is only a snippet from Vitruvius's long program, but even in the full text, he says very little about engineering or material science. Significantly, given the events recounted elsewhere in this lecture, he ends his discussion of the ideal architect with the recommendation that the architects of his time familiarize themselves with contracts and with the laws regarding liability. In fact, Vitruvius asserts that many of his contemporaries claiming to be architects were actually untrained frauds. He says that a layperson contemplating construction might as well save his money and use the information in the De Architectura to build his own villa or house. Whichever way you look at it, this comment is alarming. When I observe that an art of such magnificence is professed by persons without training and experience, by those who are ignorant not only of architecture but even of construction, I cannot refrain from praising the owners of estates who, fortified by confidence in their own erudition, build houses for themselves, judging that if inexperienced persons are to be employed, they themselves are entitled to spend their own capital to their own liking, rather than anyone else's. It seems likely that some of the structural problems encountered by Roman authors may be the result of mistakes caused by the absence of professional input concerning design and materials. It's often difficult to determine whether the incompetent professional described in an ancient source is the architect or the builder or both. For example, during the reign of Tiberius, the collapse of an amphitheater at Fidenae, just outside Rome, is reported by Tacitus to have killed or injured 20,000 people. One Attilius, of the freedman class, having undertaken to build an amphitheater at Fidenae for the exhibition of a show of gladiators, failed to lay a solid foundation and to frame the wooden superstructure with beams of sufficient strength. The reason is he built it neither because of an abundance of wealth nor municipal ambition, but he simply sought the work for sordid financial gain. Certainly the safe accommodation of very large crowds was and remains a major architectural challenge. Suetonius reports that in the reign of Augustus, quote, during a public show in the theater of Marcellus, the people were overcome by a fear of collapse. Augustus was unable to calm them or to reassure them in any manner, so he moved from his own seat in the theater and sat down in that part of the structure which was most suspect, unquote. What made that particular part of the theater suspect? Cracks in the structure, the noise of settling, or perhaps the unfamiliar odor of partially cured mortar? Clearly the Roman masses were skittish about the possibility of collapse, even in a major public structure specifically designed to accommodate them. The amphitheater at Fidenae was constructed of timber, but the theater of Marcellus, which actually survives in quite good condition today, was built of concrete and stone. Given these events, one marvels at the insouciance of the audience ensconced in a convertible turning wooden theater structure built in the 1st century BC by Gaius Curio as part of his father's funeral games. Pliny the Elder describes it. Curio had to use his wits to devise something wonderful. He constructed 2 very large wooden theaters next to one another, propped up on the swinging points of separate pivots. Before midday, a performance of plays was given in both of them, while the theaters faced in opposite directions so that the actors would not drown out each other's voices. Then suddenly they were swung around, and after the first days it was done with some of the audience still sitting in their seats, and with the corners coming around and banging against each other. In this way, Curio made an amphitheater and put on gladiatorial contests. He spun the Roman people themselves into greater danger than the gladiators. They were doomed, as it were, to perish at one moment or another if the framework were wrenched out of place from the pivots. The pivots, in fact, soon ceased to function, undoubtedly saving thousands of lives in the long run. Roman literary sources tend to focus on Rome, so we know of more construction disasters in that city. Collapses and conflagrations, however, obviously occurred elsewhere in the empire as well. As governor of Bithynia, Pliny the Elder had to deal with what seems like a whole province full of engineering disasters. In one letter to Trajan, he reports a water supply project gone badly wrong. The citizens of Nicomedia, sir, have spent 3 million sesterces on an aqueduct that they abandoned before it was finished and finally demolished. Then they made a grant of 200,000 sesterces toward another one, but this too was abandoned, so that even after squandering such enormous sums, they must still spend more money if they are to have a water supply. There are very few arches still standing, but others could be built out of the blocks of stone taken from the earlier construction. And I think that some ought to be made of brick-faced concrete, which would be easier and cheaper. But the first essential is for you to send out a hydraulic engineer or an architect to prevent a third failure. I will add only that the finished work will combine utility with beauty and will be worthy of your reign. Significantly, in his reply, Trajan tells Pliny to investigate whether, quote, individuals have profited by this starting and abandoning of aqueducts, unquote. Pliny had to deal with similar problems at Nicaea, but here we are given more details of the cause. The greater part of the theater at Nicaea, my lord, has been built, and although still unfinished, has already consumed more than 10 million sestertii, as I've been told, for the account of the work has not yet been examined. I fear that it may have been money spent in vain, for the structure is sinking and gapes open in huge cracks, either because the soil is damp and soft, or the stone itself is poor and crumbly. It is certainly worth considering whether it should be finished, abandoned, or even demolished. For the foundations and substructure by which the theater was to be held up do not appear so solid to me, although they are expensive. There were also difficulties with a bath and theater at Claudiopolis, and Pliny requests that an architect be dispatched to look into all of these problems. We cannot determine who was at fault here, the architect or the contractor. Vitruvius defines the goals of architecture as firmitas, utilitas, and venustas, strength, utility, and grace. In his letter to Trajan concerning the aqueduct, Pliny seems to aim a little lower, claiming only that the new aqueduct will embody utilitas and pulchritudo, utility and beauty. He seems to have given up on firmitas altogether. And by the way, it wasn't only in the provinces that aqueducts fell down. Here is an offhand comment by a 4th century biographer of Septimius Severus and his building activities in Rome in the early 3rd century. Severus also built the Septimian baths across the Tiber near the gate named after him, but the aqueduct serving it fell down immediately after its completion, and the populace was unable to make any use of the baths. Aqueducts and baths were the most expensive Roman structures, so this incident, so casually dismissed, represents a punishing financial loss. The enormous Hadrianic Hippodrome at Jerash in modern Jordan is a rare archaeological combination of architectural failure, a rare archaeological documentation of architectural failure. It was one of the largest engineering projects in this elegant Greco-Roman city's history, but less than a century after its construction, the downhill retaining wall failed. The winter rains quickly carried the central part of the racecourse down the steep slopes below, and the remains of the now useless structure were taken over by potters' workshops. The hole was recently filled in so that tourists could be entertained by chariot races, but you can still see the outline. Sometimes the faults attributed to architectural design seem trivial to the modern mind, but according to Dio Cassius, an insult directed at Hadrian by Trajan's proud and prickly architect Apollodorus proved a mortal error. Hadrian first exiled and then put to death the architect Apollodorus, who had built several of Trajan's monuments in Rome. The true reason was that once, when Trajan was consulting with Apollodorus about something to do with his buildings, Hadrian interrupted them with some comment, and Apollodorus said, "Oh, go away and draw your gourds. You know nothing about these matters." For it happened that Hadrian, at that time, was priding himself on some such drawing. Long ago, the archaeologist Frank Brown made the appealing suggestion that these gourds, called kolokuntas in the Greek, referred to the shape of the daring, complex umbrella domes seen in several structures at Hadrian's villa, the interior of the vaults reflecting the segments on the surface of a gourd. It now seems more likely, however, that the reference to gourds was uttered in the context of a contemporary insult, meaning more or less cabbage head. Dio continues the story as follows. When Hadrian became emperor, therefore, he remembered the insult and sent to Apollodorus the plans for the temple of Venus in Rome, to show that it was possible for him, Hadrian, to create a great work without the architect's help. He asked if the structure was satisfactory. Apollodorus replied, "Oh, that the cult statues had been made too large for the height of the cella, for should the goddesses wish to get up and leave, they would not be able to do so." Hadrian was both annoyed and deeply pained at his blunder, so he killed Apollodorus. Insufficient headroom for goddesses might not seem a major fault, but architects, including Apollodorus, could get into great difficulty through the miscalculation of proportions, poor surveying, or the non-delivery of necessary components at the appropriate time. The emperors owned most of the major marble quarries in the Mediterranean during the imperial period, and much of their output was designated for buildings constructed by the state, such as temples, basilicas, baths, or colonnaded streets. One mechanism by which architects in the imperial bureaucracy facilitated rapid and efficient construction was through the advanced production of large architectural members, such as Corinthian columns, column bases, capitals, and entablature, according to a standard range of sizes. The monolithic columns the Romans employed for larger projects, for example, were produced in shaft heights of 20, 30, 40, and 50 Roman feet, while 40-foot columns were relatively common around the empire, such as here on the Pantheon. 50-foot columns were very rare, since they were exponentially more difficult to quarry, transport, and erect. A 50-foot monolithic granite column weighs 100 tons. The issue has a direct relationship with the Pantheon. Modern observers have often commented on the peculiar vestigial pedimental triangle in the facade of the Pantheon, indicated here by the red arrows, slightly above the join between the projecting porch and the transitional block to the rotunda. The architectural historian Wilson Jones has argued persuasively that the architect who designed the Pantheon planned on using 50-foot tall column shafts for the porch, but in the end, he could only obtain the 40-foot granite shafts that now support the porch. The porch had to be lowered, leaving too much of the transitional block visible, and the vestigial pediment was added at the point where the portico would have joined if supported by columns of the expected height. The stratagem probably was intended to smooth the visual transition to the dome. Given the expense of the structure, the prominence of the facade, and the astonishing engineering achievement of the dome, this was a very public embarrassment, if not quite a full-blown architectural disaster. Recent research on brick stamps indicates that the Pantheon probably was designed and construction largely completed during the reign of Trajan, rather than during the reign of Hadrian. This archaeological evidence makes it likely that Apollodorus was the architect of the Pantheon rather than Hadrian. If Apollodorus was in fact responsible for the design, Hadrian must have derived immense pleasure from the spectacular mess his nemesis had gotten himself into. Aesthetic disasters of this type may not have bothered the Roman man on the street, but cost overruns certainly did. It will not surprise anyone who has recently built or renovated a house that the most frequent themes in Roman jurisprudence regarding legal actions over construction involve the following three issues: poor workmanship, delays in completion, and cost overruns. Aulus Gellius preserves a lively anecdote concerning an interview between Cornelius Fronto and an architect and some builders in the 2nd century. Several builders were standing next to Fronto. He had summoned them to construct new baths, and they were showing him various plans of baths drawn on delicate parchment sheets. Once he had selected out of these one layout and plan for his work, he asked how much it would cost to complete the project. After the architect had replied, about 300,000 sesterces, more or less, one of Fronto's friends added, and about 50,000 more or less. Fronto's friend may have been naive to postulate a mere 17% overrun. A hypothetical legal example in the digest casually assumes a 50% overrun in the contracted cost of a villa. Then as now, cost overruns were an important issue. Vitruvius complains bitterly about the problem and his desire for a law to prevent it. If there were such a law, unqualified persons would not swagger abroad with impunity, but persons trained in entirely accurate methods would practice architecture with confidence, nor would owners be led on to unlimited and lavish expenditure. And the architects themselves, controlled by the fear of a penalty, would be more careful in calculating and declaring the amount of the cost. Given the natural and enduring propensity of architects to underestimate costs, it's odd that the engineers advising the Emperor Claudius as he planned out the harbor of Portus were so overwhelmed by the potential expense that they would not even dare to provide an estimate. The historian Dio Cassius reports their reluctance. Nearly all the grain the Romans consumed was imported, but the coastline near the mouth of the Tiber had neither safe landing places nor suitable harbor basins. With this in mind, Claudius undertook to construct a harbor basin. He would not be dissuaded, even though his architects replied to him when he asked how great the cost would be, "You don't want to do it." But he conceived a project worthy of the dignity and greatness of Rome and brought it to completion. First, he excavated a considerable plot of land near the coast. He built great moles on either side of the basin, and thus enclosed a great body of water. And in it he fashioned an island carrying a lighthouse. Although providing a partially protected anchorage, 16 hectares in area, this vast engineering project was not entirely successful. Only a few years after completion of the basin, a sudden storm sank 200 ships anchored within it. The hexagonal inner basin, completed by Trajan a few decades later, may have been built to provide better protection. Although the design may have been flawed, at least Claudius's breakwaters stayed put after they had been built. Sometime around 25 BC, King Herod the Great constructed the great harbor of Sebastos to serve his newly refurbished city of Caesarea in Palestine. Given the design and the importation of pozzolana from Baiae for the hydraulic concrete, it's likely that the Italian engineers supervised the project, the largest artificial harbor in the whole Mediterranean. The construction of two enormous breakwaters on a very exposed coastline was a technological tour de force. Complex floating caissons were built by shipwrights. Enormous concrete blocks were laid on a carefully designed cushion of imported stones. Facilities for weakening wave action and purging the outer basin of sand were designed into the structure. The whole complex was finished off with sculpture, towers, a lighthouse named after a member of the royal family, and a splendid temple to Augustus. Josephus describes the complex in glowing terms. Although the location was generally unfavorable, Herod contended with the difficulties so well that the sea could not overcome the solidity of the construction, and its beauty seemed finished off without impediment. He let down large concrete blocks into the sea. When this submarine foundation was finished, he then laid out the mole above sea level, 200 feet across. At intervals along it were great towers, and at the harbor entrance there were colossal statues, 3 on each side, set up on columns. The harbor had been magnificently designed, and the best Roman harbor engineers carried out the construction with the finest materials. Even for the wealthy Herod, this was a very expensive project. These engineers, however, apparently were unaware of the behavior of the local sand and of the Pleistocene clays beneath it. At some point in the second half of the 1st century A.D., a seismic jolt, or perhaps simply the weight of the enormous structure, liquefied the supporting sediments beneath the heavy breakwaters, and they gracefully but irreversibly sank below sea level, where they can be seen today. The elegant harbor facilities were transformed into navigational hazards, and ships began to pile up on the artificial reef. One ship carried ingots of the Emperor Domitian, dating the catastrophe to somewhere around 90 AD. Given the absence of any real understanding of pedology or geology seen at Nicomedia and Caesarea, Roman contractors understandably protested that faults in the subsoil simply were not their responsibility. Although we are not aware of other failures on the scale of the harbor of Sebastos, problems arising from subsidence on land or in the sea must have been common. We have already seen Pliny, as governor of Bithynia, dealing with the ramifications of collapsing aqueducts and theaters in Bithynia. So it's not surprising that Roman jurists became involved with this issue. A lawyer with the slippery name of Labeo published a case book with the disquieting title Plausible Views, Pythanorum in Greek, and it's quoted frequently in the digest. At one point, Labeo gives this opinion: if you, the contractor, undertook on hire the creation of a water channel and then built it, but subsidence ruined it before you had it approved, the risk is yours. However plausible Labeo felt this opinion to be, Paulus registered a conflicting one. On the contrary, if this occurred due to a fault in the earth, the lessor will bear the risk. But if it happened due to a fault in the construction, the loss will be that of the contractor. Claudius's harbor at Ostia may have been a reasonable success, but the public opening day ceremonies for another of Claudius's great engineering undertakings wound up as a laughable farce. The tunnel that drained the Lacus Fucinus, just northeast of Rome, was an enormous and ultimately very successful engineering undertaking. On the gala dedication day, Claudius, accompanied by a great crowd of notables, watched the first outflow of water from a nearby banquet table. Suetonius describes the occasion. Claudius brought to completion public works of great in scale and utility. The following are particularly notable: an aqueduct begun by Caligula, a drainage tunnel for the Fucine Lake, and the harbor at Ostia. He attacked the Fucine Lake no less in the hope of profit as of glory. After 11 years, partly by digging a canal, partly by tunneling through the mountain, he finished the project with difficulty, even though 30,000 workers were employed continuously without a break. Upon completion, he gave a banquet above above the outlet of the Fucine Lake and was nearly overwhelmed when the water was let out with a rush and overflowed its channel. The engineers apparently did not have a sufficient grasp of the flow rate through the tunnel, and the imperial patron was nearly carried off along with his picnic table. Even if the architects provided well thought out plans and appropriate estimates, it was builders who made these plans a reality, and builders varied greatly in their skill and honesty in antiquity as today. Incompetent builders could also make use of defective tools, compounding the difficulties. Lucretius comments on the cascade of construction problems resulting from improper measurement. Finally, as in building, if the original straight-edge ruler is deformed, or if a faulty square departs from straight lines, or if an architectural level is a trifle off in any part, the entire structure will necessarily be made imperfectly and be leaning over, warped, sloping, leaning forward, leaning backward, and everything askew. The result is that some parts seem about to collapse and some do collapse, all betrayed by the original faulty decisions. Given Cicero's heartless unconcern with the tenants of his collapsing shops, one is delighted to hear of his own problems with the structure of the palaestra in his home on the Palatine, which was slowly tumbling down the slopes of the Palatine onto his brother Quintus's house below. He ends a letter to his friend Atticus with the following self-centered comment. I must consult Vettius Chrysippus about the collapsing wall. In these times when life is so uncertain for men of light and learning, such as myself, I had set store on a quiet summer's enjoyment of my palaestra on the Palatine. But at the same time, the last thing I want is for Pomponia and the boys to live in fear of falling masonry. Well, Cicero's concern for his relations clearly is very grudging, since as a man of light and learning, he had hoped to avoid the inconvenience of renovation. In fact, Cicero seems to have been something of a lightning rod for construction disasters. In a letter to his brother Quintus, he reports on his own supervision of the work the architect and contractor Diphilus was carrying out at Quintus's country villa. This Diphilus was true to his profession in always being behind schedule. He had the added qualification of incompetence. On the Manilius property, I found Diphilus even slower than, well, Diphilus himself. However, he had nothing left to do except for the baths, promenade, and aviary. The pavements appear to be laid correctly. Some vaults that I did not approve of, I have ordered to be changed. Diphilus, the so-called architect, has erected columns that are neither perpendicular nor opposite each other. He will have to pull them down, of course. Eventually, he must learn the use of the plumb line and the measuring line. It is, in fact, not difficult to find errors in the execution of surviving Roman buildings, although they seldom are egregious enough to be visible to the casual observer. For example, mismeasurements were made in laying out the foundations of several parts of the baths of Caracalla in Rome. In the Frigidarium, one of the main rooms in that spectacular building, the foundation for the east semicircular apse was wider than that for the west apse. This error probably was discovered only when the superstructure was being erected. In order to avoid carrying the disproportion into the walls, where it could be easily seen, the builders shifted walls, basins, and columns as far as they could on the wandering foundations and largely concealed the problem. As we have seen, major engineering projects, particularly those involving water, could spawn problems on a monumental scale. Claudius may have had to scamper up the slope with his glass of Frascati when the Fucine tunnel was opened, but at least the tunnel functioned. Around AD 138, the military engineer Nonius Datus laid out the plans for a 428-meter-long tunnel to be cut through a mountain for an aqueduct to serve Saldai in what is now Algeria. After a delay of 10 years, the project finally started, and Nonius came out of retirement to supervise the commencement of tunneling from both sides of the mountain at once. Illness, however, forced him to return to Lambesis. 3 or 4 years later, the dozy engineers left behind to supervise the project realized to their horror that the combined length of the two tunnels was greater than the distance between the two starting points. Obviously, the diggers had missed each other deep in the mountain. At this point, the long-suffering engineer Nonius was once again pulled from his lounge chair on an Algerian beach. We know all this because, once the project was completed, he made sure to protect his reputation by setting up the lengthy inscription seen on the screen, giving details of his precise role, or as he says, to clarify my work on this aqueduct. The account is dedicated to Patientia, Virtus, and Spes, patience, valor, and hope, goddesses who should have kept a better eye on their acolytes as they chipped away at the hard stone in the darkness. Here is what the ill-starred pensioner Nonius found when called back the third time to this project from hell. I set out, and on the way was attacked by bandits. Poor Nonius, things go wrong all the time. My staff and I were stripped and injured, but escaped. I came to Saldai and met Clemens the procurator, who took me to the hill where they were bemoaning the poor quality of workmanship on the tunnel. It seemed they were considering abandoning it because the length of tunnel that had been driven was longer than the width of the hill. Their bearings evidently had diverged, both to the right, away from each other, but the straight line had been staked out across the hill from east to west. Since it was I who had first taken the levels, marked out the aqueduct, and had a second copy of the plans made, which I gave to Petronius Keller, the procurator, I completed the task. When it was done and the water admitted, Valerius Clemens dedicated it. Nonius may have been remarkably prone to bad luck, but he was no fool. He had kept a second copy of the original survey, and no one could say that the debacle was his fault. In essence, the Saldai inscription points up the surprising inefficiency of the imperial system. In this story, we hear of incompetence, miscommunication, the lack of local talent or training, and the general absence of technological specialists. It's unlikely that these problems were specific to the North African province alone, which was rich and well populated. Maintenance was another issue for ancient Roman structures. Frontinus, administrator of the waterworks of Rome in AD 98, evaluated the aqueduct system of Rome as superior both to the Egyptian pyramids and the Parthenon. With such numerous and indispensable structures carrying so many waters, compare, if you please, the idle pyramids, or else the indolent but famous works of the Greeks. Well, in fact, the two latter monuments are now in better shape than the aqueducts. Hydraulic structures, of course, require more maintenance than a temple, or certainly more than a pyramid. But even with the best of intentions and imperial resources, an energetic administrator such as Frontinus could hardly keep up with essential repairs. He reports on 2 groups of maintenance workers, 700 persons in all. Both gangs are divided into several classes of workmen: overseers, reservoir keepers, inspectors, pavers, plasterers, and other workmen. Both of these large teams, which regularly were diverted to employment on private work by exercise of favoritism or by negligence of their foreman, I resolved to bring back to discipline. Therefore, I wrote down the day before what each gang was to do, and I put in the records what each gang had accomplished each day. Well, this is interesting. The seemingly obvious concept of daily work orders for maintenance staff and record-keeping of work accomplished only occurred to the curator aquarum of the city of Rome 400 years after the first aqueduct had been built. This delayed innovation gives a striking indication of the chaotic daily reality of a seemingly stable system. Despite Frontinus's reforms, the challenges remained real. I quote his administrative handbook. The numerous and extensive works are constantly falling into decay, and they must be attended to before they begin to demand extensive repair. The necessity of repairs arises from the following reasons. Damage is done by lawlessness of abutting proprietors, by age, by violent windstorms, or by defects in the original construction, which has happened quite frequently in the case of recent works. Nor is greater care required for any engineering works than for such as are to withstand the action of water. For this reason, in accordance with principles which all know but few observe, honesty in all details of the work must be insisted upon. Well, Frontinus had his hands full. Although we hear little about it, maintenance of public and private structures of all types was an ongoing concern, our third category of problems. And lack of maintenance may have resulted in the loss of many well-constructed buildings. Even in the 2nd century, this had become a pressing problem. We hear this in the Digest. The deified Antoninus Pius issued a rescript to the effect that money bequeathed for a new building was to be converted to the upkeep of those that already existed, rather than being spent on beginning a new building. So, if a community had enough buildings, but not enough money for maintenance and repair, new buildings or money for new buildings should be diverted. In antiquity, as today, the contract for maintenance or repair of a public building could be a source of enormous profit for an unscrupulous politician or contractor willing to skimp on labor and materials. Gaius Verres, who was prosecuted by Cicero for plundering the province of Sicily while serving as governor, 73 to 71 BC, this Verres had already made a good start on his career of corruption while praetor in Rome a few years earlier. The temple of Castor and Pollux in the Roman Forum was generally in good condition, but the rapacious Verres saw the potential for profit. I quote Cicero, "In so large and elaborate a building, even if it were in sound and good repair, Verres calculated on finding some means of working a profitable job for himself. He began to feel that it would be a shame to abandon a great elaborate building like that without lining his own pockets richly. Verres went to inspect the temple, but he could see nothing that might require further work and provide the opportunity for graft. So he asked one of his gang members for advice, Habonius, who apparently had already had experience in this sort of fraud. Cicero reconstructs the conversation as follows. "Look you, Verres," said Habonius, "there's no job you can do here, unless, perhaps, you would like to demand that the pillars be made exactly plumb, exactly upright." The hopeless ignoramus Verres inquired what plumb meant, and they told him that practically no pillar could be made possibly exactly plumb. "Why, damn it all," says Verres, "let's do it. Let's demand that the pillars be made exactly plumb." Habonius was familiar with the wording of the contract, which merely gave an inventory of the number of pillars and said nothing about their being plumb. Well, Verres appropriated sufficient funds for the deconstruction and re-erection of the affected columns, but in fact he made do with an inexpensive and superficial repair. In some cases, simply the application of a new layer of stucco on the shafts. He charged 9 times the real cost, pocketing the difference. Well, this account gives us much to think about. A corrupt politician on the hunt for profitable public construction contracts, the politician potentially in charge of architectural maintenance does not know what plumb means. The legal contract does not even specify that the columns have to be plumb. Who is at fault here, Verres or the entire system? One last example. The maintenance of the architectural heritage of Rome in the 4th century, just when the fortunes of empire were declining in the West, must have been an extraordinary burden. Nevertheless, buildings of varying types continued to be erected at Rome and elsewhere, and true to a long-standing Roman building tradition, some of them continued to collapse. The Relationes of Symmachus outlines a disaster story. A few years before AD 382, the Emperor Gratian entrusted to Kyriades, an engineer and senator, construction of a new bridge over the Tiber north of the Aventine. Subsequently, he extended the contract to Auxentius, also a senator, but not an engineer. The bridge was nearly complete when one of the arches fell down during the winter of 382. The two senators quarreled over which of them was responsible. So the administrator Symmachus called in several trustworthy so-called masters of the art of building to evaluate what remained standing. At this point, Auxentius, the one who was not an engineer, disappeared with what was left of the project funds, and work on the site stopped. The unflappable Symmachus nevertheless completed his report as follows. It was established that a length of the bridge had been begun at the beginning of winter and had collapsed under the impact of the river, but did not seem to have damaged some of the other parts of the bridge. A second section was examined, and an area of stonework was discovered below water with gaps in it. Kyriades, giving us the advice of his specialist knowledge, told us that the stones had been set in this way so that liquid mortar could be run in later, and the parts separated by gaps would thus be bound together. His successor in the work, Auxentius, ought to have taken great care to do this, but he was said instead to have contrived that the open spaces should be filled with bales of hay and grass. He supported this by quoting from the record of work done. Symmachus ends his letter by asking the emperors to decide how the, quote, the rivalry of these quarreling men may be stopped, and how the expenditure may best be made good, and the bridge firmly built, unquote. His words closely echo those of Trajan almost 300 years before, reminding us that not much had changed over that time. Even in the context of the sad litany of disasters reviewed above, one has to admire the perverse ingenuity of Auxentius in substituting hay and grass for mortar in the submerged foundations for a bridge. Vitruvius, although already pessimistic about the sad state of architectural practice, would have gaped at the effrontery. I have, of course, exaggerated the negative in my account of Roman engineering and construction, but I think that some important issues are raised by the stories narrated above. Many of the reported difficulties resulted from issues that still trouble modern construction: incompetent architects, engineers, and contractors, fraud at all levels, absence of enforcement of building standards, and insufficient funding. The very rudimentary understanding of the behavior of subsoils may have caused some of the collapses recorded as well. Just to make us feel a little bit better, I'll point out that the Roman engineer did not have a monopoly on architectural failure in antiquity. We can find familiar provisions even in the law code of Hammurabi, written around 1780 BC. I quote, "If a builder build a house for someone, even though he has not yet completed it, and if then the walls are toppling over, the builder must make the walls solid at his own expense." Or a little farther along, "If a builder builds a house for someone and does not construct it properly, and the house falls in and kills the owner, then that builder shall be put to death." Vitruvius might well have approved of this harsh penalty. Of course, the Roman achievement in engineering and architecture was in general a remarkable success, and much of it lived up to Vitruvius's ideal standard, whether it has survived for us to study today. Why did some structures survive and others not? Apart from the issues noted above and the selective practices of post-Roman plundering and demolition and recycling of building remains, building on a very large scale with brick-faced or stone-faced concrete seems a favorable factor, along with the use of vaulted roofing of stone or mortar. The surviving buildings all appear to have been over-engineered, conforming to Vitruvius's first requirement, firmitas, stability. And firmitas seems an appropriately optimistic word with which to end this presentation.